Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Switch. My name is Patty Hampton, and I am excited about this week's topic. Did you know that the nonprofit HR brand ecosystem has exclusively focused on the talent management needs of the social sector, including nonprofits and social enterprises, for more than 20 years? This episode is all about building a talent-focused workplace culture. Listen in as Lisa Brown-Alexander, President and CEO with Nonprofit HR, shares how organizations can shift culture to prioritize talent in support of organizational strategy. Share this production in your communities and download the slides and transcript. Visit nonprofithr.com/The Switch for a video recording, presentation, and other assets. Without further ado, here's Lisa.
So thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lisa Brown-Alexander. Good afternoon again, everyone. We're excited about this topic. Obviously, we're all dialed into the current events around us, and the reality series will take you through a series of conversations about the various elements of talent management and looking at those components of talent management through an equity lens. So this afternoon, we're going to spend some time talking about workforce planning and why it matters, understanding, getting a better sense for who's on your bench, who's on your staff, who's in your workforce, how you determine who is next in line for opportunities as they become available, and then helping you identify some strategies for building in equity into your workforce planning activity.
This event was originally recorded as a nonprofit HR webinar. Check out other nonprofit HR events and virtual learning opportunities at nonprofithr.com/events.
All right, let's continue. So let's talk about workforce planning. When we talk about workforce planning, what are we referring to? We're really talking about the exercise or the activity that an organization uses, the analysis that you would use to align your workforce composition with your long-term and short-term organizational strategy and business needs. Looking at who you have in your organization as it relates to what it is you say you want to accomplish. Said another way, workforce planning is really the process that you use to ensure that you have the right number of people with the right skills in the right roles in place at the right time to deliver on your organization's goals and to ensure that you are an impactful organization. That's really what we're talking about when we talk about workforce planning. So why does it matter? Particularly right now, as we find ourselves in the midst of dynamic organizational change, either as a result of the coronavirus crisis that we find ourselves living in and through, or as a result of other organizational dynamics, including social unrest and social justice, right? The new call for social justice. And so workforce planning is particularly important in times like this, because what it does is it enables you to really be more resilient as an organization, to plan for the use of your assets within your organization, to ensure that you're eliminating surprises, that you're kind of identifying your various business cycles and have a talent plan that aligns with that in terms of who you have in what roles at what time. So there are essentially 4 key components to workforce planning. The first is to set strategies and priorities based on what it is you say you're trying to accomplish as an organization, whether it's expanding your program offerings or expanding projects, shifting in your mission focus. All of that needs to be taken into consideration when you're planning for your workforce. And so establishing what your talent priorities are in relation to those shifts and those expansions and those retractions in some cases is where workforce planning really is important, right? So setting priorities and strategies is your first step. You next want to assess your current skill base. Who do you have on your team, on your bench? What is it that you have in terms of your workforce composition? Evaluate the current composition of your team, not only by skills, but it's also important to understand the age, the gender, the race, the ability demographics of those who work in your organization. That's really, really important for you to effectively get through the workforce planning process. You'll also want to forecast your future needs. So one is looking at current needs, your current demographics. The other is looking at those demographics against the future. How will the workforce change? What is your population doing in your region? Where is it moving to? So that you can understand how you need to adjust your recruiting activity, your talent acquisition processes, so that you can identify the right talent to support your organizational strategies, right? So that's the forecasting component of workforce planning. And then what you'll want to do is look at after the current analysis and the future analysis, you want to adapt strategies to help fill the gaps between supply and demand. So who you have and who you need. What's the gap between those two things? And then what skills and what composition of talent do you need to fill those gaps to ensure that your organizational goals and objectives are met? Very high level. Many of you know this already, but this is a refresher for those of you who are familiar with and have gone through workforce planning before. For those of you who have not, this is a very quick primer to set the stage for our conversation today. So 4 elements of workforce planning: priority setting, current analysis of the work team, looking at the future to understand who you need and who will be around you and who's available to you from a talent perspective, and then looking at your current staff, looking at your future goals and strategies, and identifying where you might have some gaps and where you may need to fill those gaps with either new talent or the redeployment of talent. So a big part of workforce planning is the analysis piece, right? It's looking at the supply, who is in your current labor supply for your region, for your city, or if you're a national organization and are kind of boundaryless and borderless, then looking at the national labor supply. Then you'll also want to review and understand your business plans and objectives to understand what your demand will be for talent. Again, we mentioned that before, but there's a supply analysis, then there's the demand analysis. Followed by that is the gap analysis. We talked about that already. That's the skills. What skills do you need to close the gap between supply and demand? And where do you have perhaps excess talent or surplus talent? And then where do you have deficiencies? And then when it comes to solutions, finding solutions, that's where you really want to implement, analyze and implement the strategies that you need to fill those gaps, right? That's the solution. That's where you find people to meet your future needs. So 4 components of the analysis process: supply analysis, demand analysis, gap analysis, and solution analysis. Ultimately, all of this matters for a couple of really important reasons. The first of which is your talent, the talent in your organization, whether it's the executive assistant or the executive director. The talent in aggregate is your most important tangible asset as a nonprofit leader, as an HR leader. The investment, the nurturing, the cultivation of your talent is how you make a difference in the communities where you serve. Without talent, without the people to do the work, it is almost impossible to advance mission. I wish we talked about this more as a sector, but we don't. What my hope is that as we continue to look at talent more and more, there'll be a greater appreciation for the importance of talent. It is as important as fundraising and finance and programs. Those of you who have followed me and heard me speak before, that's of no surprise to you, the position that we've taken at Nonprofit HR, that your talent is your most important tangible asset, and therefore warrants planning just like you plan for strategy and program impact. We also know that workforce planning matters because ultimately your ability to understand who you need and when you need it really will help to drive your organization's productivity. It'll help you cut unnecessary labor costs. It will also improve your financial performance as an organization, which even as a nonprofit is important, and will help to drive innovation. Ultimately, it will dramatically enhance organizational impact. Why? Because you're going to have the right people in the right roles at the right time in the right places. If you don't plan for that, you may end up with the wrong people in the wrong roles at the wrong time. And we know that there are real costs, both measurable costs and those costs that are not measurable when we don't have the right people in our organizations. Productivity is lost, morale is undermined, labor costs are higher than they need to be. Ultimately, our financial performance might be impacted, our relationships with our donors and our funders may be impacted, and we really won't be as innovative and as creative as we need to be if we don't have the right people in our organizations. All of this is why workforce planning matters. So let's talk about who's on your bench. Let's talk a little bit about that supply analysis. Who do you have in your organization? Understanding your organization's workforce composition is an exercise in risk management. Now, you may not think of workforce planning as risk management, but it absolutely is. What is your risk capacity and what is your risk capability? What do I mean by that? What I mean is, who do you have? What kind of capacity do you have to manage, from a talent perspective, the various scenarios that your organization might face? Do you have the right people doing the right things at the right time? So do you have the right number of people? And do the people that you have the right skill set and capability to meet your future needs? Do you have the right skill set and numbers of people to meet your current needs? We do a lot of work with nonprofit organizations around organizational assessments. And what we often find is that there is a disconnect between what it is you say you're doing as an organization and who you have within your organization. And so by managing your workforce and engaging in workforce planning, you're mitigating risk associated with having the right number of people or the wrong number of people. And you're also mitigating risk associated with having the wrong skill set or the right skill set, right? Depending on the lens you look through. So it's really important to understand your workforce composition.
You have been listening to The Switch, a nonprofit HR podcast on powering your people with talent management insights, best practices, and hacks. Looking for a thought partner to help you integrate talent into your mission's strategic plan? Well, the good news is nonprofit HR has solutions to meet your unique talent management needs. Strategic planning is an annual ritual for many nonprofits. Yet, countless organizations plan for programs and fundraising without thinking about the talent needed to meet those goals and ultimately their mission. With more than 20 years of expertise under our belt and the bench strength of credentialed consultants, we partner with all mission types and offer solutions that span project-based human resources consulting and outsourcing, search, total rewards, and DEI. Join the community of social impact organizations that have trusted nonprofit HR to help them achieve their full potential through their people.
So, what do you know about the composition of your organization's workforce? This may seem like a very straightforward answer. Of course, I know I have 52 FTEs and I've got 5 people in this location and 10 people in another and 12 people in another. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, what is the age range of the staff that you have, your gender composition, your racial composition as it relates to skill set. Who do you really have? And do you know that? Have you quantified that? At a moment's notice, if your executive director said to you, give me a demographic breakdown of our workforce, could you provide it? More importantly, once you know what that composition is, what does that mean for your planning efforts? Do you have a large contingent of people who are preparing for retirement? If so, what does that mean for your organization? What does it mean for your ability to continue the work of your organization in a way that is not disrupted, in a way that doesn't negatively impact your staff? So understanding your workforce composition is an important part of workforce planning. We also want to know about the capabilities of your staff, not just who you have and how it relates to the future of available talent, right? But we also want to know what the skill set composition is like of your staff. I want to go back just for a second to this notion of composition and the number of people, capacity that you have. We know that the data tells us that by 2045, for example, the population of Caucasians in the United States is projected to drop below 50% to 49.7%. We also know that Hispanics will make up just under a quarter of the population at 24.6%, and Blacks will make up 13%, followed by Asians at 7%, those who identify as multiracial at 3.8%. If your organization is seeking to be a diverse, racially diverse organization, what does that mean for where and how you seek out talent, right? So that's a capacity issue. When it comes to capabilities, What skill sets do you have today? And what is your plan for developing skill sets to meet the needs of the future? This is important work because without understanding our workforce composition, both capacity and capability, we have the potential to not realize our goals by being proactive in our hiring processes. And so it's really important to understand both aspects, capacity and capability. So let's spend a little time digging a little more deeply into this bench strength conversation. Again, we're talking about composition, supply analysis, who's on the bench. It's important to understand, particularly if you put an equity lens on your workforce planning, to understand who you have and how that composition relates to the world around you, right? So if you're in the middle of Washington, D.C. or San Francisco, both very diverse communities, and your organization doesn't either reflect the diversity of the community around you, or more importantly, the diversity of those you serve, then there's an opportunity to close that gap, right? So it's not just understanding census data going forward, but it's also understanding who you serve and ensuring, if that's important to your organization, that the demographics of your organization reflect those of the communities that you serve. It may be important for you to have better gender balance. We know that more than 70% of the nonprofit workforce is female. If you look around your organization, who is on your bench? Who's on your leadership team? Is your leadership team primarily comprised of men? Is it primarily comprised of women? Or is it a balance that is reflective of the rest of your organization or reflective of your available workforce? These are important things to know if you want to really engage in equitable workforce planning practices. Understanding the racial composition. We know from a number of reports, published reports, that both nonprofit boards and nonprofit leadership teams are primarily white, regardless of the location of the organization. Now, how much of that is reflective of what is happening within your organization and in the communities where you reside, right? Is that a reflective balance? Do you consider that an equitable workforce composition? And so these are the kinds of things that you'll want to look at. Pull your employee data, look at age, look at gender, look at race, look at identity, look at earnings. That's an entirely different subject, but important to understand that as well. Examine your turnover and recruitment data to understand things like vacancy length and recruitment rates and turnover, the number of applicants you have for any given position. How many applicants do you interview for vacancies that fit into these demographics so that you can understand whether or not you have a gap in the demographics, right? When you go looking to fill a position, are 99% of the applicants women, or are 99% of the applicants men, or are 99% of the applicants people of color versus white people? It may not be that absolute, but understanding that and analyzing that data can help advance your workforce planning objectives. You'll also want to take a look at internal influence. What do we mean by that? What we mean is that organizations, the decisions that they make around programmatic direction and budget cuts and external pressures will all influence your composition or your supply analysis. Where is your organization going from a programmatic standpoint? What is your financial situation? What are kind of external factors and internal factors facing your organization that could influence who you need now and who you might need in the future? We also, of course, as part of the supply analysis, want to look at current competencies. We've talked about this a few times now, and I want to drill it in because it's really important to understand the skill sets, the strengths, the weaknesses of your workforce. There's software that can help you with this, but some of it is old-fashioned rolling up your sleeves and analyzing who is in your organization, what skills they have, and how do those skills fit with your future needs. And then finally, don't forget, you're competing with the nonprofit next to you, the nonprofit organization up the street, the nonprofit organization across town. We know that many emerging professionals and others, actually folks of all ages, are looking for meaningful work. But you're no longer just competing with nonprofits, you're also competing with social enterprise, you're competing with corporate social responsibility programs, that are connected to large brands and smaller brands as well. That is your competition for talent. And so it's important for you to understand, and to the extent that you can get exposure to or information about their workforce strategy, understanding that as you plan for your own. So these are important things to understand. I want to pause just for a little bit to see if we have any questions, to make sure we don't go too far down the road before answering questions if we have any.
How does one obtain such staff demographic data? Should an employer ask employees to self-identify in terms of gender and ethnicity? If so, how many or how may an employer conduct such survey without seeming intrusive or possibly discriminatory?
That's a great question. Well, it's okay to ask your staff to self-identify. That's really the best way to do it. You may look at someone and make assumptions about their age, their gender, their ethnicity, how they identify. And so asking people to voluntarily provide that information is a great way to do it. Asking the question in and of itself is not discriminatory. What becomes discriminatory is if you take employment actions as a result of how someone identifies in your organization. So the act of asking for demographic information in and of itself is not a problem. It's important to ask that if you want to really understand your workforce composition through an equity lens, to be sure that you're kind of having a holistic approach to workforce planning. So asking the question is not the problem. It's when you take discriminatory actions against people as a result of how they identify, right? And that's an entirely different matter. But be transparent with your staff. Help them understand that you're trying to engage in a workforce planning exercise and you want to understand who you have in your ranks. And that in order to be most accurate, you want the staff to identify to you the way they see themselves. So that would be my answer to that. Do we have another question?
We do. Here's another. What do you do if you are now bare bones because of layoffs due to COVID-19 impacts? Decrease programming or do more with less?
Yeah, that becomes a little more challenging, right? So workforce planning may not be your top priority if you're just trying to hold your organization together. But someone, whether it's your executive director or someone from your leadership team, needs to keep their eye on the ball, because hopefully your organization will get to a place where it can get past the coronavirus and get back to not being as lean and mean. And what will you do then, right? So it's important to understand, especially if you have limited resources, understand who you need and when you need them so that you don't waste financial resources on talent. Keeping in mind that your payroll, your salary and benefits costs are likely to be your most significant expense on your budget. And so making talent mistakes costs. And if you're in a lean and mean situation because of COVID, you don't want to waste money, nor do you want to waste time. So my suggestion would be take advantage of your payroll system, ask your payroll provider to help you with gathering demographic information. That way you're not having to do it manually. If you don't have a payroll system like ADP or Ceridian or Paychex, then you may have to resort to Excel spreadsheets. But it's an important and helpful exercise, particularly if you know that your organization will ultimately get through this tough time and need to rehire in the future.
You're listening to The Switch. Follow along with this podcast. Download the slides and other visual materials at nonprofithr.com/The Switch.
All right, let's keep going. So we're still talking about who's on your bench. So a lot of us are struggling right now. We're looking internally and we're saying our organization is not reflective of the workforce composition that we want for whatever reason, whether it's by gender, by age, by race, by whatever identifying or dimensions of diversity that we struggle with. But how did you get here? So how did you arrive at a place where you might have a homogeneous organization? This is where workforce planning it gets a little more challenging. We move away from the mechanics to really starting to examine how we arrived where we are. And the question to ask ourselves is, how are the systems and the people in our organization perhaps contributing to our current workforce composition and capabilities? are there biases built in to our organization that are perhaps contributing to why we are what we are, or how we're composed as an organization? And that's a more difficult question, right? That's where we start to look at issues like, bias, and do we have bias in our decision making, and do we have bias built into our promotional activity and our hiring practices and our leadership development investments, right? Because all of those things can contribute to sameness or oneness, or the lack of diversity that many of us are anxious to have right now, particularly in light of kind of this renewed awakening around racial justice and racial equity and equality. And so that's a more difficult decision. How did you get where you are if you're not where you want to be? So let's go to the next slide and let's unpack that a little bit more. All right, so what I'd like you to do is, as you think about the composition of your workforce, both staff and leadership, there's some questions that you want to ask yourself about who's up kind of for next opportunities. But in order to do that, in order to make those assessments, you have to first understand what challenges exist within your decision-making frameworks, and whether or not you perhaps need to step back and analyze those who make decisions about talent within your organization, to be sure that you're not undermining your efforts to be an equitable organization. And so that requires, really an equity assessment. Separate and apart from workforce planning, what systems and what is happening with the people in your organization and the decisions that they make as it relates to talent that may be creating some additional challenges within your organization from a talent perspective. And then you can move to this conversation about who's got next. So some of you may be familiar with that term. It's a common term used in basketball when players are playing kind of pickup basketball or an unstructured game. Someone who's ready to get out of the game will look back and say, who's got next? Who's coming in next? Because I'm getting ready to leave. Think about it like succession planning, right? As people leave the organization or move into new roles, who is being prepared for those next opportunities? And how much of those decisions about who's got next are being negatively influenced by implicit bias or unconscious bias? How many of those decisions are being influenced by those factors? What systems do you have within your organization that might be creating challenges for building an equitable organization? So when we think about who's got next, we're thinking about who are your key players? Who are your key leadership players? Some of you have already gone through succession planning exercises. That's essentially what a succession planning exercise is. Who are your key players? And if someone were to leave unexpectedly or even leave on a planned basis, who would fill those roles in key positions within your organization? But you first have to identify what your key positions are, right? So who are those key players? Who do you see as capable of leading, which is a trickier question, right? It's not so much who the obvious leaders are, but who do you see as capable, and why do you see them as capable or incapable? We'll talk about that in a second. But who will be the people that you choose to fill future opportunities? What criteria do you establish or have you established for who sits in what seat in your organization? Is it based on where they went to school, their relationship with other key players in the organization, their social influence? I hate to say it, but their gender? Is that a contributing factor? So think through, this is where the critical work comes in with workforce planning, is really thinking about the criteria that you set and whether or not any of that criteria is undermining your effort to be an equitable organization. What barriers might you have set unnecessarily or even unintentionally within your organization to make it less accessible for a diverse group of people to access those opportunities? So this is what we want you to think about. What criteria have you set? And are those criteria really critical? Are they essential to what it is that you're trying to do as an organization? Or are they just practices that you've perpetuated over the years? We also want to take a look at organizational practices and systems that help you identify promise and potential, right? Do you have extensive recruitment processes within your organization? Do you use recruitment teams or screening teams as a way of diversifying who gets to make the decision about who comes in your organization. So these are just some of the things that you'll want to consider and examine, take apart, put them on a table, and really examine what practices and systems within your organization are not only helping you find people and move people into roles, but also help you even consider staff who may have promise and potential. So it really requires a discovery process, right? A lot of us are anxious to jump into kind of fixing the wrongs that have occurred over, hundreds of years. And I applaud every single one of you and me, really, we all want to do it. But how do we really spend time in discovery to make sure we understand the underlying systems and practices within our organization that could impact this very question about who is eligible for the next opportunity, who has promise, and who has potential? We want to look at it both from the promise and potential side, but we also want to look at what might be limiting that analysis around promise and potential. As equally important as the who is the why. Why have we identified those that we have within our organization as key players? Now that may seem like a really obvious question, but really, why do we do that? Why do we identify certain people as ready and able and have lots of potential and others as not? What in our own thinking and our own systems is contributing to our decisions around what and why and when, right? Why do we see certain individuals as leaders and not others? Again, we're talking about workforce planning, but now we're really trying to get into this concept of equity and how equity plays into the decisions we make about who is seen as a leader and who is not seen as a leader. Why do we see certain individuals as leaders and why do we see others as not leaders? Think about that. Have an intentional conversation at your leadership team level or management staff, whatever the appropriate level is within your organization, about the why. The who might be easier, but the why is a lot more difficult. And really examine those practices against equitable practices and what it means to have equity from a gender perspective, from a race perspective, even from an age perspective. How many of us have said to ourselves, oh, so-and-so is too young to be a leader at our nonprofit? Why is that? What if that individual really has really strong natural leadership skills? Are you missing out on the opportunity to elevate someone to a leadership role because of their age, right? I know we're thinking a lot about race right now, but what about age? What about gender? Do we see men as more capable as leaders than women? Many organizations will tell you no, but when you look at their leadership composition compared to the rest of the staff, you may find that there are many more men at the leadership level than at the staff level. And why is that? Have we internalized in our organizations that men are more effective leaders than women? And the only way to get at those questions is to spend some time in discovery, asking both the what, the who, and the why. So, what limiting beliefs or organizational biases exist within your organization that might prevent certain groups from advancing in their careers? Why are we engaging in the systems that we do that help us either identify or not identify promise and potential? These are just some of the questions that we encourage you to ask yourself as an organization when you embark on a workforce planning journey, if you are particularly interested in doing so in a way that is founded and based in equity, right? We'll get this deck to you, so you don't have to memorize these questions. You don't even have to write them down. You'll get this deck after today's session and can refer back to these questions and intentionally put these questions in front of your colleagues and your peers at the leadership level, because this is really where this work begins. So when we talk about workforce planning and equity, ultimately, I know that many of you want to know, okay, so this is all great, the theory is wonderful, but how do I achieve equity in my workforce planning activity? Glad you asked, let's unpack it. So first, let's establish what we mean by equity. I've used the term equity several times during today's presentation. You may be, using the term diversity in your organization. Diversity, equity, and inclusion mean very different things, but I really want to focus on equity today. Because what equity means is that your organization recognizes that there may be some disparities within your workforce, within your talent management systems that don't provide the kind of relevant support that is needed for overcoming barriers within the organization. In order to have an equitable organization, you'll want to be focused on creating supports for those who are in your organization to thrive, right? Can I thrive as a Black woman in your nonprofit? Can I thrive as a gay man in your nonprofit? And what gaps might exist? What is disparities in either people practices or systems that might impact my ability to have an equitable place in the organization and contribute like everyone else, right? That's what we mean when we talk about workplace equity. Do I have what I need as an individual, regardless of how I identify? Do I have what I need to thrive?
You have been listening to The Switch, a nonprofit HR podcast on powering your people with talent management insights, best practices, and hacks. Looking for a thought partner to help you integrate talent into your mission strategic plan? Well, the good news is nonprofit HR has solutions to meet your unique talent management needs. Strategic planning is an annual ritual for many nonprofits, yet countless organizations plan for programs and fundraising without thinking about the talent needed to meet those goals and ultimately their mission. With more than 20 years of expertise under our belt and the bench strength of credentialed consultants, we partner with all mission types and offer solutions that span project-based human resources, consulting, and outsourcing, search, total rewards, and DEI. Join the community of social impact organizations that have trusted nonprofit HR to help them achieve their full potential through their people.
So we also want to look at workplace culture, and when we think about equity, because ultimately culture and behavior are what support whether or not we're an equitable organization. Equitable workplace cultures demonstrate behaviors that value and respect individual groups with different backgrounds. So regardless of my background, my gender, my age, my race, my political affiliation, which nowadays is quite fraught, I still have the opportunity to thrive and to be successful. As an organization, we recognize that there might be some specific challenges and circumstances that people from different backgrounds may need to have closed in order for them to be able to contribute in a really comprehensive and holistic way. And so if your organization is committed to being an equitable workplace, and if you're committing to engage in workforce planning in an equitable way, you have to first recognize that there may be disparities and that there may be challenges that are experienced by different people in your organization as a result of their background and their experiences in and through life. So without that recognition, you can't really put an equity lens on your workforce planning practices. So I want to just spend a little time talking about some of the benefits of workplace equity, because in workforce planning as it relates to equity, ultimately, we've talked about this a little bit already, but ultimately your organization will benefit by having a higher level of achievement when you are focused on who you have to do the work. If you have the wrong composition of people working for you, working in your organization, your organizational goals and objectives will be impacted. If you need someone with really strong grant writing experience, but you only have a grant writing assistant and someone who lacks in-depth skills and experience, your ability to land and win new grants will be impacted, right? So both at the individual level and the organizational level, when we focus on workforce planning in an equitable way, our achievement as an organization and at the individual level is elevated. We also are more likely to retain the staff that we have. What do I mean by this? What I mean is that by having the right composition of talent, we are not putting unnecessary pressure on individuals within our organization to make up for the gaps in talent that exist within our organization. We're not asking one person to do the job of three. That's kind of the old school way of doing things, and that was a common practice that many nonprofit organizations would engage in as a way of saving money and demonstrating to the public that they were prudent and fiscally responsible. But I would implore you that that is not a solid or even effective workforce planning strategy. It's just not. Because what will happen is the people that live within your organization will burn out, they will leave, they will talk about you, and that will undermine the very goals and objectives that you set as an organization. So retention is important and a key benefit of workforce equity and workplace equity. Your ability to attract talent is also impacted by how effectively you plan for your workforce. Being able to hone in very specifically in a laser-focused way on who you need really is a strategy in maximizing your talent dollars. By focusing specifically on your skill gaps, and in order to identify those skill gaps, you need to do that supply and demand analysis, right? Understand what you need now and in the future, and then you can go forward and specifically look for that talent in a way that does not waste time or money or result in frustration. When it comes to brand value, what are we talking about here? We're talking about employer brand value. Your ability to effectively manage your hiring practices, your workplace culture, leadership development opportunities all have an impact on your employer brand, on your ability to be seen in the public as an employer of choice. I know that's a goal for many of you. And so it's important to nurture that brand value. And the way to do that, to care for it and to feed it, is to have solid attraction and retention practices and cultural practices that don't undermine who you are as an organization and what people perceive of you, more importantly, as an organization. People talk. You can look right now and see the number of major brands that have been subjected to scrutiny because they have failed to demonstrate equitable practices internally, even though they have made bold and slick statements about diversity, equity, and inclusion over the last several weeks. Many, many employers have been called out. Everyone from Google to Microsoft have been called out because of their failure to align what they say with what they do. You do not want to be that nonprofit. You do not want to be the nonprofit that is championing social justice externally but not practicing it internally, right? And so this is important in your workforce planning efforts because they will be impacted by your ability to attract and retain staff. And then finally, the results that you achieve as an organization will be impacted as well if you do not have the right people in the right seats at the right time doing the right things. Your results will be adversely impacted. I've been in this space for 25 years, and I have consistently seen the correlation between poor workforce planning, ineffective culture, and organizational goals and objectives not being met. Those things need to be in alignment. And so I just wanted to be sure to highlight that as part of our conversation today. So in the dead center between planning and equity, workforce planning and workforce equity are people, power, systems, practices, and importantly, organizational readiness. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that who holds power within your organization, how power is distributed and understood and demonstrated in your organization will absolutely influence your workforce planning activity, right? And so it's important to spend some time as part of that discovery process understanding the power dynamics within your organization because they absolutely influence the decisions that you make about who sits in what seat and when. They will also influence the extent to which you demonstrate equity. The people within your organization, we talked about this already. Do you have people within your organization who have not kind of come to terms with their biases and their decision-making processes and understand how those decisions influence equity within your organization? That requires both discovery and training, not just one or the other, but both. And so examining the people who are making decisions about who sits where and ensuring that they have the tools that they need to make equitable decisions is really really important. Again, we talked about the systems. What things do you have baked into your hiring and retention and promotional and leadership development practices that either advance equity or undermine it? The only way to get to that is to examine those systems and to really look at them through an equity lens. Now, this is not easy work. Please do not misunderstand. I'm not trying to simplify or dumb this down. This is heavy, difficult work and is often painful because it requires you examining things that you perhaps have taken for granted or that you've never questioned before. You may need the help of somebody from the outside to objectively assess and analyze the extent to which your practices and your people and your distribution of power are equitable. So don't be afraid to ask for help. There are resources out there. We certainly provide support to organizations to help them understand where they stand from an equity perspective. But this work is not for the faint at heart. So I don't want to oversimplify the weight and difficulty of this work. Finally, and most importantly, examine your organization's readiness to do this work. Nothing would be worse than engaging in a workforce planning exercise with an equity lens, with the goal of being equitable, if you know your organization is not ready. That will create resentment, frustration, and undermine whatever efforts you might be trying to engage in when it comes to being a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization. So check your readiness. Be honest with yourself about where you are. This workforce planning work through an equity lens may be more than you might be ready for. And be honest and just kind of take your time. We did not get here overnight as a country, and we will not fix this overnight. But consistent, intentional effort around workforce planning and creating an equitable workforce is really the order of the day. When it comes to systems, I just want to call out those systems that you'll want to look at. Your forecasting exercises and how you assess talent, the talent that you have and what you might need in the future. Succession planning, how do you go about succession planning and identifying key players? Who do you put into your leadership development programs, and what kind of leadership development training are you making available? Your recruitment, retention, redeployment, and retirement decisions. Those are all representative of systems, your talent systems that may need to be revisited or examined at least to determine the extent to which they are inequitable or equitable. So these are systems. These are systems that you'll want to look at. When it comes to practices, here we're referring to things like performance management, right? We know that performance management, for example, often drives who's eligible for promotion, who's eligible for leadership opportunities and succession. So if you have inequity built within your performance management system, that will perpetuate inequity when it comes to the systems work that we just identified. So it's important to look at your performance management practices to gauge whether or not there is inequity built within the performance management structure within your organization. The same applies to career pathing. How do you put people on various career paths, if you even have them? If you're an organization of 5 people, clearly you won't have career paths for people to go on. But take from this what might be appropriate for you. What practices are you currently engaging in to backfill positions when a position gets vacated suddenly? How do you identify who's ready, or whether or not you go outside or inside? How are you matching competencies against current and defined needs? How are you placing people within roles when they become available? And how are you measuring all of this to gauge whether or not certain groups are benefiting more than others, right? Are women benefiting more than men? Are men benefiting more than women? Are your Black staff benefiting more than your white staff? Or your Latino staff more than your Asian staff? Or your straight staff and Christian staff versus those who identify otherwise? So these are all things that you'll want to look at and examine as you consider building equity into your workforce planning practices.
You're listening to The Switch. Follow along with this podcast. Download the slides and other visual materials at nonprofithr.com/The Switch.
One of the things that I don't want you to miss in this notion with equity, right? Many of you are familiar with equity theory. Equity theory is something that was developed by a researcher many, many years ago. his name is escaping me right now. I apologize, but the principle or the definition of equity theory is that an employee wants to get out of an organization as much as they put in. And so it's important to understand what your staff perceptions are and their feelings and experiences are regarding workplace equity as it relates to opportunities and planning. Are they getting out at the same level that they're putting in? Do they have the access to opportunities in a way that they feel is commensurate with the effort that they put out for your organization? That's something, again, that you'll have to unpack as part of your equity planning and workforce planning exercise, but it's something that I wanted to kind of get on your radar and to think about. If you have no clue how staff perceive or how they feel about workforce planning in your organization and the opportunities that are made available to them, it's a question worth asking. And finally, I wanted to just share some actionable steps that you can take to develop equitable workforce planning practices in your organization. I alluded to this earlier, but it's really important to make sure your walk and your talk are in alignment. So don't talk about workplace equity without addressing why you're doing it and what it looks like for you and for your nonprofit, for your organization. Be sure and be clear that you have addressed and defined your what and your why before going out and making public statements. Or even statements to your own staff. Spend some time exploring what equity looks like, what it means for your organization, and why it's important to you and to your mission. Explore and seek to understand your organization's history, not America. That's important, and you can get that information about the nation's history around bias and discrimination. But what is your organization's history with bias and discrimination? Do you have a drawer full of EEOC claims that have been rendered against your organization? That's important to understand and know, because your staff will have a sense for that as well. They will have experienced bias and discrimination. And if you don't face your own history as an organization around equitable workforce planning practices and other talent management practices, it's going to be very difficult to engage in an equitable workforce planning strategy. You've got to understand your own bias as an organization and the discrimination that you may have engaged in, albeit unintentionally, as part of this work. Use data to drive your decision-making process, to uncover inequities. Look at that workforce composition data again. It will tell you some things about what you have done to date and maybe what you need to do in the future, right? So look at your data, your turnover data, your promotional data, your hiring data, your rejection data, and look for recurring themes as a way of understanding where there may be some inequity in your workforce planning practices. Commit to redesigning your workforce planning strategy with equity at the center, right? Again, we're talking about what equity means, which is to eliminate those disparities that would otherwise prevent someone from thriving in the workplace. And so commit to putting that equity lens on whatever you do as it relates to workforce planning. It's important to also seek buy-in from the full demographic representation of your leadership and your workforce. What do I mean by that? Understand the perspectives, the experiences, the feelings, the perceptions of the full diversity of your workforce. And that may mean having conversations with staff of color, staff who identify as under 30, staff who are over 60, staff who've been there for a long time, management, women, men. Don't be afraid to ask questions of people by their demographic groups, the groups that they identify as, because what that will do is give you some in-depth insights into how people are experiencing your organization, which will then inform your workforce planning practices. Finally, prioritize internal equity when it comes to workforce planning. When you identify that there's something broken or that there's a major disparity, prioritize fixing that, not only in workforce planning, but in all of your talent management practices. And then finally, lead by example. And what I mean by that is, if you want to be an equitable organization, you must demonstrate equitable leadership. You must convey to your staff that regardless of who they are, where they live, where they were born, who they were born as, that they will have the opportunity to thrive fully and freely within your organization. And so with that, I'll close. We've got lots of time for questions. I hope this has been helpful. Workforce planning is not something we talk about all the time as talent professionals and HR professionals. And so I hope this refresher has been helpful. I'll turn it back to Atokatha to take any questions that might have come in.
Thank you, Lisa, for all the information you shared this afternoon. So I'll get started. Some of these you may have already answered, but I'll ask them and we can move through them swiftly if so.
Okay.
Here's number one. At what stage in a person's employment do you ask that demographic information? Upon hiring or after they've been hired?
You can certainly do it after you've brought someone on board. I don't recommend doing it before unless you have an EEOC compliance requirement as your organization. And that's typically when you that might be built into a contract or a government requirement based on your funding. If you don't need to ask it pre-employment or as part of the hiring process, you can certainly ask it after, which is what I would recommend after your employment decisions have been made, to get that information once they're on board, or even when you have a large number of people join your organization. After that, if you've added a program, getting that information from those individuals on at least an annual basis is helpful. People don't change their identity, right? Often, so you don't have to. I don't want to suggest that you have to keep asking for it, but as new people come into the organization, perhaps as part of your onboarding, you provide them with a questionnaire that they can complete to self-identify to help build your data.
Next question. What type of rewards other than compensation would you suggest?
I'm not sure I understand that question in the context of workforce planning, but I would suggest looking at all of your talent management systems, including total rewards, how you pay people, how you reward people. I would suggest looking at those through an equity lens. We're going to actually explore all components of talent management as part of this series through an equity lens. So more to come on that. I hope that's helpful. I don't think I quite got the question.
Here's the next one, Lisa. Organizations really want to strategically do workforce planning. Who in the organization is the right team to work on these projects? Is this project-based or ongoing?
Workforce planning can be done kind of on a periodic basis. Certainly, if you're realizing a change in kind of mission focus, bringing on new programs, then you'll need to revisit your workforce plan. But the idea is that the work is done in conjunction with or immediately following your strategic planning process. And it can really be owned by any number of people. Typically, it's owned by the HR folks, but it can also be owned by your leadership team if they have the experience and they know how to do that. Or you can bring in a consultant to help you. But most often, workforce planning is owned and managed by the HR or talent management team.
Next question. Are you able to shed light on skills-related barriers in addition to demographic-related barriers?
Well, an example of a skill-related barrier would be requiring a skill set or making a skill set a priority in your decision-making process. For example, when it comes to hiring or promotions. If you require a master's degree from someone who perhaps could do the job without it, or creating unnecessary years of experience. You might say that someone needs 15 years of experience, when in fact, if they had 7 or 8, they'd be able to be successful in a particular role. And so that's where skills can be used artificially to keep certain people out of roles. And many times organizations will do that either out of pressure because they want to kind of convey that they've hired the very best and brightest. And so they require that they come from a certain school or that they have a PhD or that they've worked in a particular role for 15 or 20 years. And that in fact may not actually be necessary for success. So I would look at your position descriptions if you have some and really examine the skills requirements that you have for each role to determine whether or not they are in actuality what you need or if they are instead just what you want or what some one person may want in the organization and really not necessary. Those can serve as barriers when we require more than is necessary, which has a tendency to put certain segments of our workforce out of reach for opportunities.
Next question. So how do you get organization leaders to turn this around when there is misalignment? In theory, we know, but it is challenging to get CEOs to take it seriously. For example, people leave and they share their experiences and the CEO ignores it.
Yeah, that's a tough one. CEOs respond to money. And so if I were in your seat, I would put this crisis, this challenge in the context of money. Quantify how much it is costing your organization to make poor hiring decisions, quantify the cost of poor promotional decisions, poor leadership development investment, and put that in front of your CEO as a way of making the business case for why workforce planning is necessary for your organization. No one ignores money, not in this day and time, and certainly not in the nonprofit sector. And so sometimes I think we try to appeal on kind of, emotion, or we try to make an appeal based on it's the right thing to do. That sometimes may not be enough. Money is rarely ignored. Partner with your CFO. If you don't have access to the financial data, partner with your CFO or your director of finance to help you quantify the cost of high turnover, poor hiring decisions, and then put that number in front of your leader. Talent, I guarantee you, is the largest expense you have on your budget, and therefore simply can't be ignored.
This event was originally recorded as a nonprofit HR webinar. Check out other nonprofit HR events and virtual learning opportunities at nonprofithr.com/events.
Next question. How do organizations diversify their workforce in a homogenous environment? For instance, I previously worked for a nonprofit that primarily hired white women with military connections. Employees outside of those groups were not engaged in workforce development.
Yeah, the fact that you recognize that is a good first step, right? If you are in a homogenous community from a racial perspective, there are other dimensions of diversity that you can engage. Race may not be it. If you're in a predominantly white community and that's who you have available in your workforce, then looking for, a large contingent or a diverse contingent of people from a racial perspective may not be your option. But looking for folks who live outside of the military community might be how diversity is realized in your organization. Or finding older people or younger people, or those who come from different backgrounds other than the military, may be how diversity is realized. So you want to think about diversity a little bit differently. If racial diversity is not possible because of where you're physically located, then try to leverage other dimensions of diversity, and then gauge your organization's readiness to be inclusive. Because it's one thing to be diverse, it's an entirely different thing to be inclusive. So if people do come in from outside of the military, how will they be received? How will their ideas be embraced? That's something you want to examine, because if you bring in a slew of people from outside of the military, but the people who have a military background hold all the power in your organization, there may be a struggle. And those non-military people may find themselves cycling out prematurely, which will ultimately cost you money and may undermine your diversity efforts. So that would be my suggestion. Look at diversity broadly. It may not be racial diversity, but there are many other components and dimensions of diversity that you might be able to take advantage of.
Next question. What does it mean for an organization to be ready? Does waiting for everyone to be ready stall the start of this very important work?
No, that's an excellent question. What I mean when I say, is your organization ready? It's really looking at your leadership, right? So ultimately, leaders of organizations are the ones who set the tone. If you've got resistance in your organization to really take a deep dive into diversity, equity, and inclusion, you need to know that. And the way to know that is to engage in conversation, and to, if you're not able to do that yourself, find someone who can help you. No, everyone on the team doesn't have to be ready, but you do need a critical mass. You need buy-in. You need to be sure that you have the support of those in your organization who are determined to be key, so that the work that you engage in around this does not get undermined, right? So you don't have to have 100% agreement, but you do need to have a critical mass from those who have the power and influence your organization to kind of call it and make a decision, because without them, it's going to be very, very difficult work. And this work is already challenging. So yeah, 100% is definitely not required, but you definitely want a critical mass.
Next question. How do you manage expectations when exploring future opportunities with employees about interest and career growth in the organization?
Yeah, really good question. So the smaller your organization, the more challenging this becomes. And what we recommend to organizations is that, don't so much talk about upward mobility, because when you have 5 people, there's not a whole lot of room to go up, right? Your executive director or leadership person may be there for a long time, but instead focus on career enrichment and how someone can deepen and grow their skill set in a way that complements your business needs and their interests or desires. You may reach a point in that person's time with you where you have to part ways because you don't have an opportunity for them. And being honest about that is half the battle. But look at your organization, look at those opportunities where they exist. And if you look and do that workforce planning and realize that you may not have any opportunities in the short term, meaning, inside of a couple of years, put that out there. Be transparent about that so people can self-select out of the organization if they are in fact looking for career growth. Nothing is worse than people believing that there are growth opportunities when in fact they really don't exist. That will cause resentment, disengagement, and ultimately premature termination or resignation.
Next question. We have voluntary social justice workshops and attendance is so low. How do we get majority staff engaged on such workforce planning?
So my suggestion would be that you take a step back and examine your organization's readiness. There may be fear, anxiety, doubt, pessimism, all kinds of things might be floating in the atmosphere of your organization for why people are not engaging in these conversations. Talking about race in particular is very difficult for many people. And so if people do not feel safe to have those conversations, if they don't trust the systems and the people within the organization, they're not going to make themselves vulnerable and therefore won't show up to your voluntary kinds of events. So it's important to take a step back, do that discovery. And what I mean by that is really engaging in potentially smaller group conversations to understand where people are as a way of building your DEI strategy and your equity strategy. You may have conversations by demographic groups because people tend to feel comfortable with people who are like them, whether it's by age, by title, by program, by race, by gender. But consider doing that as a way of understanding what's going on. And if you know that the trust level in your organization is low, I would recommend bringing in someone from the outside who may be seen as more objective than the people on the inside of the organization. That can often be a major contributing factor.
Next question. If after analysis you recognize you are missing a specific demographic in your workforce, how do you actively seek to hire more of that demographic and consequently bypass other qualified candidates?
It's a tricky, slippery slope, right? There is a way to attract more diverse talent to your talent pool without discriminating against others, right? So let's be more specific. If you lack people of color on your staff, being intentional in your outreach and your networking for talent from communities of color is not discrimination against those who are white. If you're making your decisions based on strongest skill set and experience, and there's support and alignment for that, and you have a whole slew of candidates who meet the business criteria, the job criteria, and you make a decision to hire someone based on that skill set, then you should stand firm on that, right? That you hired this person because they brought the best skill set to the table. Now, if they happen to fill a gap that you have identified, then be clear about that. But ultimately, you're going to have to make a decision about someone. And so be sure that whatever decision you make is based on skill and ability and what they bring to the table. But be intentional about your outreach, because it's that pool of candidates that gives you many more options to choose from versus not having any at all. I hope that answered that question.
Next question. Our organization is fairly diverse, but our leadership team of 4 people is not racially diverse. Would you suggest that we add members to the leadership team, as we don't anticipate turnover in the leadership team this year?
It's a good question. You could do that. You would need to really unpack that and explore that with the current leadership team. If having a more diverse leadership team is important, Can you reach down to that next level of leaders and managers within your organization to include them in the leadership team? That's very possible as an option. The question is, what's the readiness for that? To share power, to share decision making, to be equitable? Because what you don't want to do is invite that more diverse next level down when you're really not ready to embrace them. So you'll need to examine your own readiness as a leadership team to share decision making and power sharing with that group as a way of realizing a better, stronger, more diverse leadership team. But it's certainly worth pursuing. I know we're almost out of time. We'll take just a couple more and then we'll wrap it up. We want to be mindful of everyone's time.
Yes. Here's the next question. We are interested in creating a series of trainings, speakers, and talks about diversity and management practices. Where would you advise we begin?
Wow, there's so many resources out there right now. I would really focus on what you want to achieve. So before you jump into programs and activity, answer your question about what you want to achieve and why, and then shape your activity around that. What does it mean for your organization to be diverse, equitable, and inclusive? Quantify that in real terms, and then shape your training programs and your activities around the what and the why. A lot of us are ready to jump into training, and what happens is we'll do a training or we'll do a luncheon or we'll do a speaker series, then we'll consider our work complete. And it really isn't. And it's that kind of move to activity without thinking through the what and the why that ultimately I am fearful will undermine larger efforts at being a more diverse and inclusive workforce, because we'll see them as kind of events as opposed to a strategy woven through our programs, our operations, our activity. That's how we get to the what and the why, right? Through an examination of our programs and our culture and our people and our systems, we arrive at our what and why. And then following that, we can move into activity. It's a slower walk. I know. It doesn't get to doing something right away, but it really, in my opinion, has a much longer lasting effect if we're clear about why we're doing something and we're checking the alignment with who we say we are as an organization.
Hey, Lisa, it looks like we've just got two more questions. How do you engage with an organization when the CEO is unclear about his or her philosophy related to DEI?
Well, you can take a bottoms-up approach. If the leader is not clear on his or her approach, then perhaps you galvanize the staff and take a bottoms-up approach where a contingent of the staff help to shape the strategy and the approach and serve as advisors to the CEO who may not be sure about where to go. I guarantee you probably have people within your staff who have strong opinions and may even have some experience in this space. And so leverage them. It doesn't always have to come from the top. It will really depend on your culture and the readiness of the leader to take advice and counsel from someone who may not be his peer or her peer. But consider that as an option, a kind of a ground level, grassroots approach, bottoms up approach, rather than waiting for your CEO to be fully ready. He or she may be open to that. Check that first so that you don't undermine the effort of the team that might come together. But that would be my suggestion. If the leader's not sure, let the guidance and advice and thoughts come from others and see if they can work in a partnership.
And the final question, do you have resources or a list of questions you can ask employees to gather information about their experiences and their treatment in the organization?
Be happy to talk with you about that following today's session. Please reach out to us and we can spend some time with you talking through what that might look like for your organization. So yes, absolutely.
Well, that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. The Switch, featuring nonprofit HR's DEI practice. Does your organization need to talk with someone about the topics we covered today? Nonprofit HR's DEI practice is your thought partner for all diversity, equity, and inclusion needs. Our firm has served the social sector exclusively for more than 20 years. Call us 202-785-2060 or email us for a mini consult. info@nonprofithr.com. Looking for more episodes of The Switch? Visit nonprofithr.com/The Switch and access recordings and resources to help your organization maximize its greatest asset, your people.